There are a lot of changes happening around the Pelicans with the roster and coaching staff, but one thing still remains, Zion Williamson. But I'll tell you why there need to be changes there too. It's the Friday episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans in NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Friday, final show of Locked On Pelicans this week. I appreciate y'all hanging out with me all week as we talk all things New Orleans Pelicans here. And of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube, almost 12,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to the Locked On Pelicans podcast. And if you're an everydayer, let me know in the comments down below. I see y'all. I promise I do, even if I'm not commenting in there every single day. And of course, you can watch us every weekday at 10:30 a.m. on the Gulf Coast Sports and Entertainment Network, home of your New Orleans Pelicans. You can also watch Locked On Saints, Locked On LSU, and Locked On SEC with Chris Gordy, Matt Moscona, and of course, Ross Jackson. We got an all-star lineup here over at Locked On for you with Louisiana Sports. So I'm going to get into changes the Pelicans are making. There's a change to the roster the other day. There's a change to the coaching staff. But I want to start with this. One thing that's not changing is Zion Williamson here in terms of him being on the team. And this comes from Keith Smith over at spotrac.com, which is a great website when it comes to salary data, salary cap stuff, where he's just emptying the notebook from talking to basically everybody at Summer League. And here's the quote of him talking to a Pelicans front office executive, anonymous here. Quote, "Zion is still our guy. If he wasn't, we could have waived him for like nothing on the books. We could have reset everything. But we believe in Zion. He wants to make it work, and so do we. This partnership hasn't even come close to reaching our best yet," end quote. A Pelicans front office executive said. Look, we've kind of known this for a while that they're going forward with Zion Williamson. It's obvious by them guaranteeing the remainder of his contract, which is not them like doing it. It's just he had to be waived by a certain date. So the Pelicans didn't really do anything, and his contract just became guaranteed. Now, it's still not guaranteed in the future, so you could figure that out then. And he could, of course, still be moved later. More on that in a second. But right now, they're going forward. And there's a couple of things that I find interesting from this. The first was this partnership hasn't even come close to reaching our best yet. Like, duh, right? Of course it hasn't come close to reaching its best yet. He hasn't played in a postseason game for New Orleans, and they made the postseason twice. They've made the play-in tournament a couple of other times too, and Zion has not played in one single of those official playoff games. So yeah, of course it hasn't reached its best yet. This era under, the Zion era so far has been a disappointment from the hype that he came into the league with and the promise of when he was drafted, right? He was the most hyped prospect since LeBron James at the time, since Anthony Davis at the time. Anthony Davis was the most hyped prospect since LeBron James at the time, going at #1 overall. I think Victor Wembanyama has definitely eclipsed that. So is Cooper Flagg, let's say. But he was hyped up, right? It was golden era of Pelicans basketball, and it's just not become that at all. So the best better be yet to come for this team. Otherwise, that's pretty depressing, frankly, to think about that. I kind of find that quote just a little bit funny, in my opinion, but I get what they're saying there. The more interesting part of this quote from the front office executive is this, quote, "He wants to make it work," end quote. Zion wants to make it work. This is what I find so interesting, right? For a offseason of change for the New Orleans Pelicans, the biggest no change is they haven't gotten rid of Zion, right? And so if Zion wants to make it work, that's encouraging. we haven't always known that, let's say. And look, this is not Zion saying it. And for the record, Zion Williamson has said all of the correct things like his entire tenure here in New Orleans. He has never said, I wish I was elsewhere. People want to read into certain things that when he's asked about Madison Square Garden and he gives like a glowing, reviews words about Madison Square Garden, it doesn't mean he wants to play for the Knicks. Look, Madison Square Garden, in my opinion, is a cool place. I've never seen a game there. I really want to. So I get that, right? When you ask him, New York media is like, do you like MSG? Like, what's he going to say, right? That's just kind of doing the correct thing here. So he's never said anything other than the correct thing about wanting to be in New Orleans. But has he always wanted to be the best version of him? Has he always wanted to make it work, right? And I don't know if the answer to that is yes. There was friction between him and this previous front office for a while. And we've seen Zion not do all of the off-court things that he needs to be doing, right? He never stretched before. He more recently started stretching, right? He even kind of laughed at CJ McCollum when CJ was talking about stretching and things like that. Zion doesn't always go through shoot around before every game, and lots of players don't. And then he just kind of goes out and plays, right? Like that's what a number of guys do. They just prefer to kind of save themselves a little bit. But is that the correct thing to do? I don't really know. But I think we can safely say he hasn't taken care of his body the way that he should be doing and doing all of those little things or having the right mentality for it. And maybe I'm reading too much into this quote, and I probably am, truthfully. When it says he wants to make it work, does that mean he's going to do the right things this offseason? So while Zion is not changing in terms of being on the New Orleans Pelicans, things about Zion need to change. So in an offseason of change, that applies to Zion Williamson too. He needs to take things more seriously. He needs to be focusing more on his body, on the rehabilitation, on all of the things he needs to do to get ready for game 1 of the regular season. We've seen him play himself into shape and look incredible when he does. But when you watched him before the injury this year, he didn't look quite like himself. He didn't look fully ready to be out there. And it was only later in the season after kind of getting back into game shape. And game shape is very different than 5-on-5, practices, than just training in the off season. You need to be ready for that kind of grueling grind that the NBA season is. And Zion Williamson hasn't been. But if he's willing to make changes too, and the front, this organization is making big changes as well, that's the most encouraging thing. We can talk about Joe Dumars. We can talk about changes to the coaching staff, changes to the roster. They're going to go as far as Zion Williamson takes them this season. You can, as I've said, and the everydayers have heard this, I can see a vision beyond Zion for the first time. And I haven't been able to say that until this offseason where you're like, well, if he goes down, maybe there's something there. Maybe. It's going to take a lot, but maybe there's something there. And you can start to see a future without Zion on the team where you're not going through an excessively long rebuild like I advocated for in the beginning of the offseason. So you can kind of see it, but the biggest thing would be Zion makes the changes that he needs to make. And look, we go through this every offseason. I talk to people around the team, around him, and they all rave reviews about Zion Williamson. He's been in New Orleans for the most part, working at the facility, all of those things. That's great. We want to see all that. He was at Summer League too, made an appearance there. He's doing all of the correct things. Will it translate? Will he do them consistently? Will he do it when there's some adversity there? That remains to be seen, and that's kind of the biggest question mark. And that's been one of the biggest issues, not just with him, but this entire franchise. When there is some adversity, they tend to crumble. And that hasn't been great. Are they building more resilience? Is Zion Williamson kind of building that skill of resiliency? I hope so, because they need it, right? This team, this franchise needs some bigger changes made to them, and they're starting to do them. You might not agree with the changes, but there are changes there. And I don't know, maybe that's the first step. It's not change for change's sake. You don't want that. You want there to be a plan, a vision, and I think they have most of that. But Zion's got to make some big changes too. So while, more things change, more they say the same. I think that's the saying, right? Here there's a lot of changes, but the one constant thing also needs to change some too, and that is Zion Williamson, and we'll see. We've been through how many I've called it Zion 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0. I don't know what 0.0 we're on with Zion at this point. Maybe it's Zion 6, 7, 7.0. It's his 7th year in the league, right? If that's the case, this team can kind of buck the experts' opinions and trends of where they think they're going to go. But I will tell you this, from talking to people around the league, they're not convinced that Zion is going to be here all season long. And truthfully, that Vegas number, talking with some folks, is kind of pricing in that they think Zion might get moved, that a lot of this is to just rehab his value. And if the team was intent on trying to trade Zion Williamson and driving up the value, saying, we're not getting rid of him. We could have, but we're not, and all that is what you would do, right? Joe Dumars has said all of the right things about Zion Williamson. We'll see, though, right? It's going to be what happens during the season and how might that change plans. That's the adversity, kind of, right? When you get punched in the face, when you go on a losing streak, does that alter things? How do people respond to that? That's going to be the biggest test of this team this year. We'll see what ends up happening with that. Coming up next, changes to the coaching staff. Let's look at what that could mean for the team, why it's maybe a good thing or bad thing. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by Game Time. You ever decided last minute to head to a ball game with friends or family? Maybe it's game day and you suddenly realize you want to be in the stands. That's exactly where Game Time comes in. It's the easiest way to grab last minute tickets without the stress. I literally did this on Monday. I'm in Los Angeles. Shohei Ohtani was pitching. I got in the car and drove to Dodger Stadium because I just want to see that dude play a home run too in the first inning, which was crazy. And after giving one up, it was nuts. And I just got my tickets literally en route to the stadium on Game Time, and I got an incredible deal right behind home plate. Look, with the money you save on tickets, you can splurge on food, drinks, merch, concessions, whatever it might be, or even invite more people to come with you. Game Time makes it possible. And Game Time makes buying tickets fast and simple. Prices on the app actually drop the closer you get to first pitch, and they've got incredible last-minute deals, clear seat views, and a lowest price guarantee that takes the worrying out of buying. And Game Time is the official ticketing partner of Locked On MLB, making it easy to browse the app for an exciting upcoming MLB game. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. Become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to the Locked On Pelicans podcast. And don't forget, you can watch us on the Gulf Coast Sports and Entertainment Network. For your second listen, find the Locked On NBA podcast where there's no offseason. We actually have two, Locked On NBA and Locked On NBA Game Night. I'm on today's episode of Locked On NBA Game Night. I'm going to sneeze. Sorry. And we are talking all things restricted free agency and how it's just being changed, free agency in general around the league. So make Locked On NBA Game Night your second listen today. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts. They are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So let's get into some actual changes. If Zion's not changing in terms of his spot on the roster, there are some other changes around the team right now. And the first and foremost one is Pelicans have released Lester Quinones from his two-way contract. It's no real surprise. This just kind of falls in line with the changes Joe Dumars is making to the team. Clearly doesn't want the roster that was here last year. Quinones, played pretty well in 9 games for the Pelicans last season, right? 8.6 points. He was pretty good with the Birmingham Squadron and Delaware Bluecoats in the G League last year too, over 21 points per game. That's not who they want on a two-way deal. He's been around the league for a while. If he was going to carve out a role, he probably would have done it as well. Already. This maybe just gives him a chance to take another flyer on a guy. If they had wanted Antonio Reeves, they missed the opportunity there. I don't think that they are actively looking to have signed Antonio Reeves. So I don't think it's like they did this a little bit too late or anything like that. So I'm not overly, it's a two-way guy. Like, I'm just not overly concerned with that. Take a flyer on someone else you feel, was maybe a standout in summer league. We'll see what they end up doing. The Pelicans have done a good job with two-way players. They still have Hunter Dickinson and Trey Alexander for those 2 spots. Now they've just got to fill out the third, or maybe you just keep it open for a little bit more right now. So the bigger change would be to the coaching staff, and that is assistant coach Darnell Lazare going to the Memphis Grizzlies, where he had actually previously worked a couple of years ago. He was an assistant coach there, came to New Orleans as the video coordinator, and then was elevated to being an assistant coach. He's been with New Orleans since the 2019-2020 season. He does a lot of development work, particularly with the big man in Yves Missi last year, who showed a lot of growth, making him a little bit of a commodity as a head coach for, around the NBA, working with big men. And Memphis has a couple of them that I think they're really looking for to kind of do a number of different things. So he has been, with the team as an assistant coach for a number of years now. Again, before that, video coordinator. More changes, right? And I think this is kind of in line with what Joe Dumars' vision has been. They want there to be some changes and shakeups to this team. And you assume this was going to eventually impact the assistant coaching staff. Willie Green doesn't appear to be going anywhere. James Borrego doesn't appear to be going anywhere. But are there going to be kind of some more mix-ups here, change-ups here? And this is probably the first step. One of the things you often see is, well, the head coach might have their staff and they kind of keep a lot of the same assistants, right? That guys that they feel are loyal to them, that they know how they work well with, that they believe in. You often see, your lead basketball decision maker, GM, executive vice president of basketball operations, whatever the heck the titles are going to be. You see them often wanting to almost place somebody on these coaching staffs to kind of be like their person there. Not exactly an informant, but also not that sometimes. There's some wild stories around the league that I've heard that I could tell you, can't tell you when it comes to that sort of thing. You often get guys that, the GM, the executive wants to have some influence on coaching stuff, but you're not going to kind of tell your coach what to do because the coach would obviously quit. If that's the case, you often kind of get some of that by way of an assistant coach. This opens a spot on the bench for them to either get some new blood in there, new vision, new thoughts, all of those sorts of things, or to just kind of get someone that Joe Dumars wants on the bench and on the staff. And I'd be curious to see what might end up happening there. We've talked a lot about the changes to the roster. We talked about the everydayers heard me talking about this literally yesterday, right? You got to make sure there's other changes in the organization too. It just can't be the roster and you say everything else is good. We've talked about the player performance and care team this week. And again, I don't think the injury to Derek Queen is their fault and they're doing the best they can, truthfully. But eventually you've got to just start making some changes to try and change the perception of this franchise. The perception of this franchise around the league is not great. So the only way to change that is, one, by making changes and then winning games. And if you're keeping the same people who haven't won you tons of games before, when there's been injury, all of the stuff, right? You've got to make some changes to change the perception. It could even go to marketing and things like that. I like the social media team. Don't touch them. They're all awesome. But you've got to have some just bigger changes to shake things up with this team and just change the perception of the franchise. And look, I don't think New Jersey's is going to change the perception of the team around the league, right? That's like slapping a fresh paint of coat. While curb appeal can matter when it comes to selling houses and things like that, right? Doesn't change the overall structure. If that house sucks, that house still sucks for whatever reason. If it's rotting on the inside, even with fresh coat of paint on the outside, it's just masking that sort of thing. But look, you got to get buyers in the door in the first place. If you want free agents to come, even if everything's a mess internally, don't let that stuff leak out and put on a good show for the external side of things. And that does matter. And then you can get the people you want in, and then you can start to slowly change your organization from the inside out. That's what needs to happen with a lot of stuff here with this team, I think. Change the perception should be a massive goal of this franchise over the next couple, 3 years. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. And the easiest thing to do, truthfully, some of it in the offseason is change the players. Especially if you're working with budget limitations and things like that, right? You could fire head coach Willie Green. You could hire a new head coach. Now you're paying 2 head coaches. And if you have limitations with that, it's not going to help you in any capacity. So do what you can to change the perception. I think Darnell did a great job developing Yves Missi and some of the other guys here. Missi, good. Still has a lot of work to do to grow to be a strong starter at the NBA. We'll see if it's Looney or Missi as the starter next year. It doesn't truthfully matter. But all of a sudden then you can bring in some fresh blood and keep doing what you need to do or start getting the right people in the building if you feel you didn't have the right people in the building in the first place, right? Changing your two-way contracts is a great way to go about kind of just making some minor changes that can lead to a benefit, because if there are injuries, those two-way players are going to change a lot, right? The biggest thing that they could change that would really help the team is Zion Williamson making the right changes and being healthy. That makes your training staff look great. That's going to make Joe Dumars looking great for keeping him. That's going to make the coaching staff look good because they're then winning games. Truthfully, kind of, almost always comes back to Zion Williamson, for better or worse when it comes down to it. But they've got to change the perception. Given that I don't think this coaching staff, top to bottom, individuals might be a different story, but overall, I don't know if it's thought of that highly around the league. Making some changes there is a good thing, right? And look, guys getting hired from you to go get other jobs also looks pretty good. Borrego being interviewed for head coaching jobs and people wanting him as a lead assistant does look good here in New Orleans too. So you've got to retain the right people when it comes down to it. But they got to make some changes. You're starting to see overall changes with the franchise, and I'm sure there's going to be very many more in various other departments. We'll see what those all end up looking like. So coming up next, something I want to talk about next week that a couple other shows are doing that I think is kind of fun. What's your Pelicans Mount Rushmore? You're like New Orleans Hornets, Pelicans Mount Rushmore. Let's talk about that, because it's not an easy question and not in a good way. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and join over 11,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday to the Locked On Pelicans podcast. And if you're an everydayer, let me know in the comments down below on YouTube. For your second listen, it's Locked On Saints. There was a fight at the second training camp practice. We made it 2 days, 3 days before a fight. I forget exactly what number it is. I love that chippiness. I love that attitude here. Bring some fight, some fire with this team, that's going to face an uphill battle next season. Who involved, what happened from it, all that. Ross Jackson over the Locked On Saints podcast, making sense of the brawl. I'm probably selling that a little bit more than it is. The fight at training camp. Locked On Saints, make that your second listen today. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So I want to pose a question to you. Put this in the comments down below. This is something I'm going to do next week. One, we're doing our Locked On the NBA side is doing their top 100 players in the league. And so they kind of asked us all to pick like your 4 or 5 best players, and then we'll start to rank them from there. But let's get the players into the pool in the first place of guys that could be considered that. So we'll talk about that a lot. I'll tell you at a later date who I kind of picked in the order I picked them in. But I want to ask you this question. What is the Pelicans Mount Rushmore? This was like an NFL thing with like images and stuff that I saw earlier on in the summer. What's your Pelicans Mount Rushmore? So the top 4 players that you would kind of carve in stone as like, these are the people, right? That kind of set everything up for this franchise. Who's on your Pelicans Mount Rushmore? Like Chris Paul seems like an obvious one. Is it Anthony Davis after that, given the way that he left the franchise? Is it Drew Holiday, even though his tenure here wasn't as long as some others? What about someone like David West or Tyson Chandler? Does Zion go on there? I don't think so. Is it Jason Smith for just hip checking, body checking Blake Griffin in the Chris Paul return game? It could be that one too. Who is your Pelicans like Mount Rushmore players where it's like, these are the dudes that kind of like built the franchise? So this is not like an all Pelicans, all New Orleans basketball. You cannot put, the way I kind of do this is you can't put Pistol Pete on Mount Rushmore because he never played for this franchise. When the Jazz moved, they took the New Orleans history with them. That New Orleans history for the Jazz did not stay in New Orleans. You can't take any of the Charlotte era players either because that history went back to them when they rebranded to the Hornets from the Bobcats. So you're basically looking, at the Pelicans as a franchise since, they moved to New Orleans, and that's it from Charlotte, right? So we're just going back to the 02-03 season when that's kind of like you view them as an expansion franchise at that time. not a team that moved and has that like prior history to it. Would you put someone like Baron Davis on there, David Wesley on there? Would you pick somebody else from some of these teams that were really, really good? I'm curious what you think. This is something we'll do over the next week that I think is kind of fun to look at, but I need some help with this, right? This is kind of tough when you look at, some of the players and how good they are. Chris Paul seems safely in there, but again, what about Anthony Davis, right? David West, is Peja Stojakovic, Tyson Chandler in there. We're kind of going from that era of the Hornets, the best era in franchise history, in my opinion. Is it somebody else, right? I don't know. There's a couple of you who'd probably pick Jonas Valanciunas or Brandon Ingram as well, though I wouldn't probably put either of those guys on there. I'm curious what you all think about that, and start thinking about how you would rank the players on this team. Is Zion number 1, Trey Murphy number 2? Who's 3, who's 4, 5, 6? Let's look at 6 or 7 guys on this roster. Where do you think Zion would fall in a top 100? Is he in the top 100 with the injuries, or does that kind of remove him from it? Where does Trey fall in there, right? Knowing that he's kind of on the ascent with it all. It's a really interesting exercise, and we'll, of course, talk about where the Pelicans players fall in these top 100 rankings that Locked On is going to be doing. You'll see that. We did one for the NFL. We'll be doing them for all sports, I'm sure, too. It's kind of fun to look at. It's a fun exercise, especially deep into the summer where, there isn't a whole lot of news anymore right now. So let me know who your Pelicans Mount Rushmore is. Is there one? Could it be a coach? Could it be somebody else? Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and give me your rankings of the Pelicans in order of best player, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th on this team. Very curious what you think about that as well. So that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans, this week of Locked On Pelicans. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. This is the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I'll be back with y'all on Monday. See y'all next time.